Hello again. This is my third video in 24 hours, which considering I hardly do any videos, I look like I'm trying to rival PK for the many I can churn out in 24 hours. But anyway, when I did my last video, putting things in perspective, some of you may have noticed that I got a Skype message near the start of the video from my Swedish friend, 138, and he sent me it was actually a screenshot from an article in a Swedish newspaper, which I will try and show to you. And basically what it was like a daily update of number of cases and number of deaths and so on and so forth. But you'll see with his arrow in the question mark, there's a -3 figure for, forgive my Swedish here, Nya Dödsfall. And for you non-fluent Swedish speakers out there, I will help you out on that front, because what that actually means, according to, here's a Swedish translation for it, Nya Dödsfall means new deaths. So what the Swedish paper was saying that yesterday there was actually -3 deaths. So obviously some people must have come back to life, Lazarus and co. But that was just a bit of an aside. But this leads into the topic of this video, because this is just to give you some more perspective, and it's from a Swedish perspective that I'm going to give you more perspective. So if we go back to our old faithful worldometer, which we were looking at in my video yesterday, or today actually, it's still today, it's only 11:30. Stone cold sober, as you'd imagine, because it was only a Monday night. I've not been drinking. But before we just go down here, here's an interesting thing from the worldometer. Worldometer, they have population figures, and let's just look at their menu here. The menu only has population and coronavirus. That's the only two topics on their menu. Now, isn't it amazing that as of January this year, or early January this year, Worldometer just decided, before there was any pandemic or any pish like that, they just started recording figures for countries. And I think if we scroll down here, you can see when the first date starts. January the 22nd is when they started recording figures. Isn't that amazing? They're starting recording figures before any country in the world is even bothered by this alleged pandemic. But Worldometer are right on the ball, and they have started a complete new page, diversified from just population. They've added a new entry to their menu, and we're going to deal with coronavirus. And they seem to be like the go-to place for figures. But anyway, let's not say anything about the figures, but let's just scroll down. Let's have a look at their league table that they publish, and here it is. Here, this is by country, not by country, but it's just, I think it's done by, I'm not quite sure what this is sorted by here, but there's various headings, and there's one that's done by total deaths per 1 million population. That's probably the best one to get a comparison between one country and another. So if we click on that, and that shows us that San Marino's top of the list. But if we look across here, San Marino's only got a few thousand people as a population, 33,000. So let's look for countries that have got bigger populations, and Belgium is the top. UK is up there, way above everybody else, So there's UK, who've got there we go here. UK 685 people per million. And we'll work our way down, and you'll see if we go back across here, despite some people saying America top of the list, America are 10th actually, but Sweden are 8th in the list, and they've been criticised or compared with a lot of countries who didn't shut down, because Sweden didn't lock down. So Sweden are actually 8th in the list, but they are behind Belgium, UK, Peru, Spain, Italy, who all locked down. Okay, well, I don't know about Peru, but certainly the European ones did. So here we go, total deaths per million, and 571 per million people is the rate for Sweden. But it's worth just having a look at the Swedish figures, just so you can get some background before what I'm going to show you next. So Sweden have had 5,766 deaths, and here's their graph for their total cases, forget that. But new cases, total deaths, there's the total deaths. You can see the flattening of the curve. Well, there you go, it's gone up and it's completely flat now in terms of deaths for them. But this is an interesting one here. This shows the number of deaths daily. And you can easily see here that in March it went away up, in April peaked, and it's systematically fallen. And the number of deaths now, if I can zoom in here, just try and get some up-to-date figures. July 14th was 8 deaths, 24th of July was 4 deaths, and you can see right down at the end here, currently August the 2nd, 1 death, and you can see there's some days there's 0 deaths, and August the 5th, 0 deaths. So we're around about, we're next to 0 now. There's no deaths happening in Sweden at all, okay, or a handful, per day. So it's worth just bearing that in mind, because what I'm going to now show you next, there's a Scottish doctor who's he does blogs, not daily, but maybe every couple of days or weekly, sometimes. But and his name is Malcolm Kendrick, and he's one of the few doctors that speaks up against kind of mainstream view on things. And I'll leave the link to his blog in the description. But he did an article on 7th of August where he actually word for word replicated what a Swedish doctor posted. So he refers to it as, a doctor working in Sweden, an emergency care physician, contacted me to discuss all things COVID-19. He's also written a blog which can be seen here. So I'll actually go to the Swedish doctor's blog, because I'm going to actually read it to you. This is just to give some more perspective. Now this guy's name is Sebastian Rushworth, and he published this, I think it was the 5th of August he published this. Now I'll do another video with a subsequent blog he did, which is even more revealing, but I'll just read this through here, just to give some more perspective. And he titles his article, "How Bad is COVID Really? A Swedish Doctor's Perspective." Okay, I want to preface this article by stating it's entirely anecdotal and based on my experience working as a doctor in the emergency room of one of the big hospitals in Stockholm, Sweden, and living as a citizen in Sweden. As many people know, Sweden is perhaps the country that has taken the most relaxed attitude of any towards the COVID pandemic. Unlike other countries, Sweden never went into complete lockdown. Non-essential businesses have remained open. People have continued to go to cafes and restaurants, children have remained in school, and very few people have bothered with face masks in public. COVID hit Stockholm like a storm in mid-March. One day I was seeing people with appendicitis and kidney stones, the usual things you see in an emergency room. The next day all these patients were gone, and the only thing coming into the hospital was COVID. Practically everyone who was tested had COVID, regardless of what the presenting symptom was. People came in with a nosebleed and they had COVID. They came in with stomach pain and they had COVID. Then after a few months, all the COVID patients disappeared. It is now 4 months since the start of the pandemic, and I haven't seen a single COVID patient in over a month. When I do test someone because they have a cough or a fever, the test invariably comes back negative. At the peak 3 months back, 100 people were dying a day of COVID in Sweden, a country with a population of 10 million. We are now down to around 5 people dying per day. This was a few days ago, as you saw from the thing I showed before. It's actually down to 1 or 2 in the whole country, and that number continues to drop. Since people generally die around 3 weeks after infection, that means virtually no one is getting infected anymore. If we assume around 0.5% of those infected die, which I think is very generous, more on that later, then that means that 3 weeks back, 1,000 people were getting infected per day in the whole country, which works out to a daily risk per person of getting infected of 1 in 10,000, which is minuscule. And remember, the risk of dying is at the very most 1 in 200 if you actually do get infected. And that was 3 weeks ago. Basically, COVID is in all practical senses over and done with in Sweden after 4 months. In total, COVID has killed under 6,000 people in a country of 10 million. a country with an annual death rate of around 100,000 people. Considering that 70% of those who have died of COVID are over 80 years old, quite a few of those 6,000 would have died this year anyway. That makes COVID a mere blip in terms of its effect on mortality. That is why it is nonsensical to compare COVID to other major pandemics, like the 1918 pandemic that killed tens of millions of people. COVID will never come close to those numbers, and yet many countries have shut down their entire economies, stopped children going to school, and made large portions of their population unemployed in order to deal with this disease. The media have been proclaiming that only a small percentage of the population have antibodies, and therefore it is impossible that herd immunity has developed. Well, if herd immunity hasn't developed, where are all the sick people? Why has the rate of infection dropped so precipitously? Considering that most people in Sweden are leading their lives normally now, not socially distancing, not wearing masks, then there should be high rates of infection. The reason we test for antibodies is because it's easy and cheap. Antibodies are in fact the body's main defence against virus infection. T cells are harder to measure than antibodies, so we don't really do it clinically. It's quite possible to have T cells that are specific for COVID and therefore make you immune to the disease without having any antibodies. Personally, I think this is what has happened. Everybody who works in the emergency room where I work has had antibody tests. Very few actually have antibodies. This is in spite of being exposed to huge numbers of infected people, including at the beginning of the pandemic, before we realised how widespread COVID was, when no one was wearing protective equipment. I'm not denying that COVID is awful for the people who do get really sick, or for the families of the people who die, just as it is awful for the families of people who die of cancer, or influenza, or of an opioid overdose. But the size of the response in most of the world, not including Sweden, has been totally disproportionate to the size of the threat. Sweden ripped the metaphorical band-aid off quickly and got the epidemic over and done with in a short amount of time, while the rest of the world has chosen to try to peel the band-aid off slowly. At present, that means Sweden has one of the highest total death rates in the world, but COVID is over in Sweden. People have gone back to their normal lives and barely anyone is getting infected anymore. I'm willing to bet that the countries that have shut down completely will see rates spike when they open up. If that is the case, then there won't have been any point in shutting down in the first place, because all those countries are going to end up with the same number of dead at the end of the day anyway. Shutting down completely in order to decrease the total number of deaths only makes sense if you're willing to stay shut down until a vaccine is available. That could take years. No country is willing to wait that long. COVID at present killed less than 6,000 in Sweden. It is very unlikely that the number of dead will go above 7,000. An average influenza year in Sweden, 700 people die of influenza. Does that mean COVID is 10 times worse than influenza? No, because influenza has been around for centuries, while COVID is completely new. In an average influenza year, most people already have some level of immunity because they've been infected with a similar strain previously, or because they've been vaccinated. So it's quite possible, in fact likely, that the case fatality rate for COVID is the same as for influenza, or only slightly higher, and the entire difference we have seen is due to the complete lack of any immunity in the population at the start of this pandemic. This conclusion makes sense of the Swedish fertility numbers. If we reached a point where there's hardly any active infection going on anymore in Sweden, in spite of the fact that there's barely any social distancing happening, then that means that at least 50% of the population have been infected already and have developed immunity, which is 5 million people. This number is perfectly reasonable if we assume a reproductive number for the virus of 2. If each person infects 2 new with a 5-day period between being infected and infecting others, and you start out with just 1 infected person in the country, then we will reach a point where several million people are infected in just 4 months. If only 6,000 are dead out of 5 million infected, that works at a case fatality rate of 0.12%, roughly the same as regular old influenza, which no one is the least bit frightened of, and which we don't shut down our societies for. It goes on to another article, which I'll do in another video, but I think that kind of puts other things in perspective again. there's a doctor on the front line in Sweden telling you as it is.